Deputy Kelly and Deputy Gazelles has indicated after that.
But,
10 minutes.
Okay, look, thank you. First of all, Ms McGrath, in relation to the interdepartmental coordination group and the steering group, would you accept that there was a lack of clarity and a lack of urgency in relation to the work of both of those groups, and also a level of inaction by those groups?
No. I accept the clarity in relation to where the group was at in its work programme, and that it was to be in recess while this other work was done. But in terms of the outputs that were required in 2009, when it went into recess, the things had been delivered on. So, what
was your understanding of the remit of the interdepartmental coordination group and the steering group when they were first established?
In the terms of first established and identified in 2005 in the implementation plan, it was around preparing for the programme of work that was to be put in place and what it should be for the CFRAM to develop the CFRAMs, and then have regard to what other non-structural considerations interdepartmentally need to be considered. The big one there was planning. The big one was, let's not exacerbate this problem. So that was around engaging with the Department of the Environment in putting in place planning guidelines around flood risk. That was completed in 2009.
And you said earlier, there was a balance between getting it right and getting it timely. So I asked about your view of the remit of both of those groups and whether there was a lack of clarity. The C&AG's report on page 48, point number 510, it says oversight bodies were established to monitor the implementation of each pilot project and national CFRAM study. However, in the case of the pilot projects, there was a lack of clarity over precise roles and responsibilities. It goes on to say that the OPW was unable to provide terms of reference for the steering and progress groups. It says it was unable to provide terms of reference for the steering and progress groups. But yet you say that there was no problem. You said there was no lack of clarity.
We have very clear terms of reference for steering groups and progress groups for the national. Absolutely, for the national, we're very clear. Sorry, so there might be in the pilots, but in relation to the national, there is very clear terms of reference for steering groups and for progress groups.
But what I'm seeing, what it says here in the report is the OPW was unable to provide terms of reference for the steering and progress groups.
Okay, so that's in relation to the pilots, not in relation to the national.
No, I think our difficulty was that we didn't find terms of reference for the steering group, the interdepartmental coordination group, and the national CFRAM steering group.
Sorry, they're not the progress groups. I'm sorry now, apologies.
Raised in the context of the C&AG's report, there were certainly questions raised in relation to the remit and the terms of reference for both the interdepartmental group and the national steering group. You say there is no problem. The report says there was a problem.
Sorry, in the context of the pilots.
No, I understand that, but that's another layer of oversight. But in relation to those two groups, there seems to be a conflict between what the C&AG says in the report and what you're saying. They don't believe that they got sufficient responses from the OPW on that issue.
Sorry, I'm accepting that. Sorry, in the outline, the implementation plan, the roles for these groups was set out. Whether they're in the form of a terms of reference, but the roles were set out. So I accept.
What does that mean? I mean, they're either a terms of reference or not. Was there a terms of reference for the group?
Sorry, the roles were set out, but I am saying that it wasn't when they came to meet and there was a recess in 2009. I am saying that at that point, that group should have recorded that because it's now moving into a different phase, we are now going to be in recess until we come back together when we have got the details from the CFRAM. I do accept that.
But if first of all, why would they make a decision to go into abeyance and to basically suspend the work of the group? So there would have to be a logic for that, and it would have to go back to its terms of reference. and I don't see how, on what basis that decision was made. It then decided that it would reconvene after the CNAG's report. So it seems a bit of a coincidence the decision was made after the report.
No. Sorry.
Just the role of the group was to help inform the development of. Remember, at this stage, what we had was a policy which said that we would minimise the flood risk across the country to property and all that. We had to turn that into a process by which it could be delivered, writing specifications, technical specifications, and a process that we would deliver it, and informing ourselves from a flood risk management point of view, but from a wider government point of view of other things that might be useful to put in there. The role of the Interdepartmental Coordination Group informed that process, and once we got that piece done, the next piece was to get involved in the technical delivery of what we now call CFRAM, but which wasn't in existence at that point. It came from and was informed by these committees. And it was developed into a process then that was tendered out to the private sector in the delivery. And at a certain point, the Interdepartmental Committee had really no further work to do until the outputs came from the CFRAM, the mapping and so on. You could then inform. We reconvened the groups at, I think, an appropriate time, but what I didn't do was it wasn't formally suspended or formally agreed with the group that they would not meet until they got certain information back on CFRAM. And I put my hands up on that. That is correct. The formality of it wasn't there. Neither is it a terms of reference, and the controller is correct, but it does say the role of the group is this, but we didn't again sit as a group and say we're adopting ourselves these terms of reference. So I'd accept the formality of we didn't set a formal terms of reference, but the role was there and we got on with doing the job as best I could say to you.
Yeah, I suppose when we started to look at this, our initial interest in it was the fact that the pilot projects were running on. And that, if you like, we could see, looking back, that these were supposed to be finished a lot earlier. So we decided we'd look at this area. Obviously, that brought us into looking at the CFRAM then, because that was overlapping the pilot projects. I suppose one of our initial difficulties was trying to identify who did we need to talk to. So in discussion with OPW, we identified that there were lots of steering groups and lots of progress groups. And so we have a diagram on page 23 of the report, which was us trying to capture the thing. Now, the first question we asked then, can you give us the terms of reference of this so that we can understand what the roles are for each of them? There were no formal terms of reference for the Interdepartmental Coordination Group or for the National CFRAM Steering Group. I have to say, I don't recall, and maybe I missed it, that there was ever an understanding that some of these groups would be set up and would suspend at particular periods. Our understanding was, for instance, that the Interdepartmental Coordination Group was, if you like, would be coterminous with the programme. And I think in your presentation you've outlined what the role of it was. And as I'm reading the role, it was to review the programme direction, progress and outputs of the implementation process. I mean, I do have a difficulty in understanding how you could be suspending a committee that is supposed to monitor progress and report on progress. So I think that would be just my reaction to it. I think at different times, different committees were set up, some of them, and we fully accept that the progress and steering groups for the individual CFRAMs, they had clear terms of reference, each of them. So there is no difficulty there. But the same wasn't true, I think, of the progress and project groups for the individual pilots.
I'm satisfied. From my perspective, there was a lack of clarity in relation to terms of reference, but I want to move on to the pilot projects, if I can, and just a number of questions around them, because what we do know is that there was cost overruns and overspend, and I think it was a valid point made by the Chair at the start of the meeting that the information that we have in relation to each of the pilots is up to 2014. So I think it would be useful if we could get a breakdown of each of the individual projects and what the initial estimated cost was and what the outturn was up to now, because I think that's first of all important. But again, to go back to the CNAG's report on this issue, Again, it's page 51, recommendation 5.3. A detailed project budget, including provision for any VAT payable, should be developed and approved at the appropriate level before significant funds are committed to any project. Now, the accounting officer of the OPW's response is, I do not agree that the recommended procedures were not in place in the OPW, which is a clear contradiction of what the CNHE says in the report. How can you reconcile that then with the fact that there was almost a 200% overrun in these pilot projects? And you can't just simply put it down to delays, and you said that you were extrapolating the national from the initial projects initially. But what I'm seeing here is you talk about lessons learned. I don't see a lesson being learned here. I don't see even an acceptance that there was a problem in relation to setting out detailed project budgets, which would include VAT provision, which would include all of the appropriate provisions that you would make for costings in relation to projects. It's been flagged up here that there was a potential failing, and we know then there was an overrun, and then the OPW is saying no, that there was no real problems here, and I don't understand that.
I think I should say the estimate of 3.5 was not correct. But to treat it as an overrun, I mean, I interpret an overrun. I ask you to do something and it doesn't cost what I asked you. It costs more and you do the same thing I asked you. It's in terms of the contract price on the pilots was 6.8 million. Allowed for within that 6.8 million is that there, not in the 6.8 million, but in those contracts, that there may be things that will arise that we need to put rates on, but we are not saying they're in the contract unless they give rise. They did happen. So
I'll take you down to the report again. Yeah. On page 45 of the CNHE's report, paragraphs 422 and 425, it says, and I quote, OPW also made payments totalling 1.24 million to principal contractors on 2 of the pilot projects in compensation for project delays and some additional works that had not been agreed in advance, which is precisely some of the concerns that were flagged. So that to me is an overrun. Would that be an overrun to you? Sorry, that's 636,000 for the River Lee project, 603,000 for the Fingal East Mead pilot. Then goes on to say, in terms of the national programme, OPW has made compensation payments to contractors totalling 305,000 to the end of December 2014, and we don't know what happens beyond December 2014. So it's clear to me that there was overruns in relation to project delays, compensation payments made, and yet there's no acceptance of that at all. It just says, I do not agree that the recommended procedures were not in place in the OPW. How do you reconcile that? I
accept the need for what the controller has said in the recommendation. For the purposes, and I accept that in relation to the pilots, the estimating and what the experience of the pilots showed us is that the budgeting we had not got correct. I accept that, but I do not accept that we didn't do budgeting. But I do accept that in terms of, because what was needed as a consequence of this.
So you do accept then that there was failure. So when it says in the response that I do not agree that the recommended procedures were not in place, are you accepting then that that was an incorrect statement to make in response to the CNHE's report?
If I just let me...
Page 51, recommendation 5.3.
Yeah. We did have budgets, but our estimating of the budgets,
That's not the point that's been raised. Of course there was budgets. The point is that there was money paid out in compensation. There was, if I'm reading the CNHE's recommendation, it's that there wasn't sufficient projections made in relation to budget provision. It didn't make proper provisions for VAT. Maybe the CNHE might comment himself. And there's a contradiction.
We included in Appendix C the cost information at the time that the pilots were planned. And basically what it says is that the pilots will cost an average of approximately 1 million for studies undertaken by contracted services and 500,000 for studies undertaken in-house. So it's a single figure. The point that I'm making around a detailed budget is, how are you going to spend 500,000 or how are you going to spend $1 million? What are the things that make up the $1 million? Because by taking apart a figure like that and saying we'll spend so much on this aspect of it and so much on the other aspect, you can look at your experience and you can say, well, that looks reasonable. Those are the kind of rates that we would be expecting to pay. If you like, you identify where you expect to spend that money. This is as much as was available for the initial kick-off. The pilots got going on the basis that they'll cost $1 million or they'll cost $500,000, depending on the way we structure it. The point I was making in the recommendation was, you shouldn't be getting into projects with a budget as lacking in detail as that. It needs something. It needs something more.
Do you accept the response to the OPW?
Now, well, I think we for many years we have had a different worldview in relation to project budgeting with the OPW. It's something that has been fought out here at committees before. And it actually relates to the way in which resources are provided for public bodies. We would consider that if you start a project that has, let's say, a 2 or a 3 year profile, you need to know what you're going to spend over the 3 years. OPW does its budgeting annually on the basis of the estimates that are available. And therefore, each year a decision is made. This is how much money we have. This is where we'll spend it. We're talking about two different things. One is a kind of a funding approach, and the other is a project budgeting approach. When I make a recommendation in relation to a project budget, I'm talking about looking forward over the full life of the project, figuring out how much it's going to cost, where you're going to spend the money, and then you ask, when will we be able to fund it out of our available resources? So we have ended up on occasion talking across purposes with one another, because we have these two concepts of what budgeting means. I'm sorry if that's kind of very technical, but it does lead us to a situation where statements may be misinterpreted.
Deputy, we're just about on time there now. I know we'll have an opportunity to come back to you. We're going a good bit over.
One last question,
yes,
actually, very quickly, was in relation to the submission to the EU in relation to the flood mapping. It's only a fraction of what was to be submitted, and the reasons given for that. 50 of 300 flood risk hazard maps. A decision was taken not to submit them, and it might have been for genuine reasons, and it's maybe more of a question for the CNAG. Should we be really cherry-picking like that and deciding what information we give or don't give? This is an EU directive, so we either should be in compliance or not.
I suppose one thing that strikes me about this is that the benefit of a strategic approach to flood risk mapping and planning and so on, that's to the benefit of the Irish people. I don't see that it actually has much relevance to the EU, because they're not funding measures to respond in general. I think that the directive was concerned that all of Europe would be advancing at the same kind of pace. And so when the directive came along, it had deadlines in it, and they were taken up as being the national deadlines. I would say in this situation, we should have had our own deadlines anyway for delivering this, and we should be reporting progress in relation to that. That's just an observation on the EU's role. I think why would the EU be penalising us for being late on these? Probably not a lot of reason, because it doesn't affect the single market or whatever. But if you like, the getting to strategic delivery of flood risk or flood protection and flood response, that's in the Irish interest.
Deputy Kelly.